joined now by Cynthia Jones, the General Manager of the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, with us on the MegaCast. Cynthia, thanks for being back with us.
Thank you so much, Tyler. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, good to have you. So coming up, you have a really interesting new exhibit going on, Collecting Mobility, New Objects, New Stories. This takes you behind the scenes at the operations there at the Henry Ford to give some insight on how you choose what goes into the museum, and then the process of obtaining those items and then putting them up for display in the museum itself. Tell us a little bit about Collecting Mobility.
Absolutely. So we just opened it this past weekend, and it'll be on display through January 2nd. We really approached Collecting Mobility because we've recently opened a new permanent exhibition, Driven to Win, which is all about racing, race cars, race car drivers, behind the scenes of racing. And we realized we had actually more acquisitions that we had brought in that we couldn't yet put on display there. So we had these amazing race cars. And then we asked ourselves the question, what else have we acquired in the realm of our mobility collection over about the last 10 years? And it's a wide range of artifacts. It's not all cars, because mobility for us is really thinking about how people move, what that does to our culture, all of the various elements related to it, whether it's accessibility technology or safety or new innovations. So there's a lot in this exhibition. I think there's a lot of interesting stories to explore. The other piece about this exhibition that I think is fascinating for our guests is that we've pulled back the curtain and we're telling you how we collect, why we collect, how an object ends up on display in the museum.
We're joined by Cynthia Jones, General Manager of the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. And what you pose in this exhibit is the question of what belongs in a museum. From your perspective individually and also collectively from the Henry Ford's perspective, what does belong in the museum? What factors go into the decision of whether or not this item versus this item is worthy of being displayed in one exhibit versus another, or generally displayed in the Henry Ford Museum?
So I think for us, it comes down to who are we and what are the stories that we can best tell, unlike other museums or other institutions out there in the world. And so for the Henry Ford Museum, we recently, a few years ago, we added of American Innovation to our title to help people understand, especially those that are traveling here from out of state or out of country who might not know about the Henry Ford, to know what it is we focus on. So we really focus in on that word American Innovation. So innovation for us are items that have changed how we live. So it's a little bit different than an invention. So an invention is a new idea that comes out. An innovation is when that idea gets adopted into our lives, something that we use that changes our daily experience. And so that's our initial lens. We're often looking at things that are firsts, things that have achieved new speeds or new heights or new innovation in materials. But more importantly than that to us is, how did it change life for Americans? So when you think about mobility, that can be things like self-driving vehicles. They're not widely out on the road yet, but we know they're coming. And so we've collected in that technology area.
We're joined by Cynthia Jones, General Manager of the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, joining us on the MegaCast. So for those that will be going to the museum to see Collecting Mobility, what's the draw there for them? Because these are items that ultimately, for some reason or another, were not necessarily previously displayed in the museum. And maybe it wasn't fitting for a show, maybe it wasn't the best potential item to show for one exhibit versus another. What makes these items interesting when they didn't make the cut from previous exhibits or other exhibits that are still ongoing?
Absolutely. I think that's a great question. So, we have an amazingly large collection. We have over 26 million items in our collections. A lot of those are paper documents. But then we have huge 3D artifacts like vehicles, like testing benches where things get figured out. everything in this show are things we've collected within the last 10 years. And an institution like ours, it takes us a while sometimes to get things out on display. We have amazing permanent exhibitions. And so if you're going to add to a permanent exhibition, sometimes the floor space is kind of limited. So you have to ask yourself, what might go away to put this object in? But our collections serve more than just what is on display. It also serves as the permanent archive. So we're collecting items also that we think that researchers will want to look at 100 years from now. So documenting change in an industry. So in this exhibition, an example of that is we have an early aluminum body test vehicle. And that vehicle eventually was part of an aluminum intensive prototyping entire research process. That process, about 20 years later, ended up changing the biggest selling truck in America, the Ford F-150. So we have an early example. We'll also have later examples. So a lot of times what you'll get to see in this exhibition is us saying, we think this is important. We're making a bet on this being important. So it's kind of fun to come see what we're betting on. It's fun to talk to our staff that are in that space and tell us what you think, because a real meaning to an object happens not only from what the museum thinks is important, but also what a guest actually thinks is important, both today and 20 years from now.
So these items, Cynthia, they're coming out of the archives. They were collected for they were collected for other shows or other exhibits. They didn't make the cut. You've explained why they're out there now, what makes them interesting. But when you do get all these artifacts for one exhibit versus another, and you pick and choose which ones should be on display, which is the best to be displayed in order to tell the certain story of these innovations, what happens to those other artifacts when they are not chosen for that? And then ultimately, how are they then preserved or returned and then maybe come back for something like this?
Absolutely. So I think it's important to know that the bulk of any museum's collection is not on display. So the bulk of our collections are not on display. We have amazing climate-controlled storage units, massive climate-controlled storage units. So you can imagine storing, we've got about 170, close to 200 vehicles on display in the museum right now. We likely have a similar number currently in storage, either because they're there for very specific stories, they've been used on our television show, they're there as part of the permanent collection, they'll rotate in and out eventually. There's a lot of reasons why something is in storage. We think that on average for any museum, about 6% of their actual collection is on display at any given time.
We're joined by, please continue.
So I think it's interesting to know kind of also the why we collect different things. And this show gets into that. So some of what we collect is for actual use. So for those folks who've gone to Greenfield Village, you know that in many of our historic buildings, we use actual artifacts. So in Firestone Farm, we're cooking with historic artifacts. Similarly, mobility, we've recently collected some objects for use. So there's a parade car Lincoln limousine that has its own wonderful story. We also collected it because we use it. We will drive it around during car shows or special events.
We're joined by Cynthia Jones. She is the general manager of the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, joining us today on the MegaCast. Their Collecting Mobility New Objects, New Stories exhibit is ongoing, began on October 23rd and runs now through January 2nd of 2022, 9:30 a.m. until 5 p.m., their regular business hours. And other interesting displays currently at the American Innovation Museum there over at the Henry Ford is the Mishlog Lego building display. That's coming up soon. That's going to begin near the end of November and run through just after the beginning of the year. Tell us a little bit about what Lego fans can expect to see at that exhibit.
This is a wonderful one. So every year for the holidays season, we love to uplift the museum with especially child-friendly things, right? Because you know that you've got your grandkids visiting from out of town. You want a great place to take them. Maybe it's your time your family comes to the museum annually. So Mishlog, which is a fantastic volunteer organization of Lego builders, every year they create a city for us. So they build Lego replicas of major iconic buildings out of the city of Detroit. Oftentimes they'll also put fan favorites in there. So perhaps you'd find a Lego Spider-Man climbing up one of the iconic Detroit buildings. They also love to put some fantasy elements in. So last year we had Hogwarts Castle, Harry Potter. There's often railroads in this. There's lots and lots of things to see and do. And Mishlog builds that for us in the week leading up to Thanksgiving. We open it officially the day after Thanksgiving, runs all the way through January 2nd. And let me tell you, you can stand there at that Lego display and study it for ever and keep finding new little fun tidbits in there.
We're joined by Cynthia Jones. She is the general manager of the Henry Ford Museum for American Innovation, and she's joining us on the MegaCast. The holidays are coming up. Some of these programs will run through the beginning of the holidays themselves, including the Lego display and collecting stories. Will also be running through that. Collecting mobility will also be running through the holidays and beyond into the beginning of the new year. But you have a lot of other specific holiday exhibits that will also be popping up throughout November and near the end of November as well, when this other Lego show pops up. Tell us a little bit about some of these different programs that will be popping up that will be of interest to people of different religious backgrounds, but also of general interest during the holiday season.
Sure, absolutely. So I think many folks think of us as a Christmas destination, right? We have a massive Christmas tree. It's iconic in the center of the museum. Folks love to pose in front of it. Regardless of whether you celebrate Christmas or not, it is absolutely really a beautiful piece to get a selfie or your family photo. But we are also very actively trying to be much more inclusive, open, welcoming to folks of all sorts of different faiths or folks who have different celebrations during this December season. And one of the questions we asked ourselves this year was, we're kind of in this second year of a pandemic. It's been a difficult time. What do we all need as we close out this year? And we said, we need a little light. We need a little joy. And so we looked around and thought about how those themes play out in different traditions, the ways that we celebrate with friends and family. So for me personally, I mark the solstice every year, the winter solstice, and kind of the return of light. We will also have Hanukkah displays up, thinking about lighting the candles. Also the foods and the traditions and what those things mean. We've been talking with the Charles H. Wright Museum, and we're bringing in a Kwanzaa display to think about where that overlaps with kind of light and family and tradition and recipes. So we're doing a much broader display. It's not large. It's a few pop-up cases to really help bring these stories to life in our space. We are also inviting local groups to participate with us. So for the solstice, for instance, we're having an astronomy club come in and talk about what is the science of this season? What is the science of light at this time of year? We're looking at an African drumming group to come in to close out Kwanzaa and the New Year with us. We've invited a group from a local synagogue if they would like to come in and talk about Hanukkah, because that happens to close on the first weekend of December this year. We've also invited some of our community partners out of Southwest Detroit. They celebrate oftentimes with luminaria, making luminaria. So what are the different ways that we bring these traditions to life across America?
We're joined by Cynthia Jones. She is the general manager of the Henry Ford Museum for American Innovation, joining us on the MegaCast. And a lot of people go to the museum to see these interesting artifacts, and have some fun activities with family and friends, and especially during the holiday season when families are coming back into the local area in some cases and joining together in larger groups. that may bring up some questions of the COVID-19 pandemic going on, still going on, and precautions being taken everywhere. What's the situation over at the Henry Ford in terms of precautionary measures and requirements that are in place?
Absolutely, great question. I think as all of us think about going out and about, especially this season with not only COVID-19, but flu, other colds, things that are spreading, it's always good to ask those questions. How do I prepare? What can I expect? For the Henry Ford, all of our staff working indoors, all of us are masked on while we were in any indoor space. The vast majority of our staff are also vaccinated. We are not a requirement of vaccination, but we do know that the vast majority are already vaccinated, and we think that is a smart step for everyone to be taking. For our guests, we will ask that you follow the latest best information. So right now, for indoor environments, we encourage you to mask on. Whether you're vaccinated or not, we know it's a great way to stop the spread of anything. So whether that's flu, whether that's COVID-19, we know it is a great way. We don't require it for our guests, but we do encourage it for any indoor space. We also encourage you to continue social distancing. So the group that you're traveling with, consider not getting super close with all sorts of other groups. And our museum is massive. We're a 9-acre space, so there's certainly lots of room to spread out. And then we also actively, for folks who may not yet be comfortable going indoors, it may not be the best choice for them, we have Greenfield Village, which is our outdoor living history experience. Holiday nights in Greenfield Village will happen on select nights throughout December. A lot of that experience happens outdoors. So if that's your preference right now, we're also trying to make sure we always give that option.
We're joined by Cynthia Jones, General Manager of the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation, joining us on the MegaCast. And Cynthia, another couple minutes with you today before we'll say goodbye. Anything else that is coming up over at the Henry Ford Museum or in Greenfield Village? Programs over the next few months as we go into the holiday season and approach the end of the year that people should be on the lookout for, or anything else important for our audience to know at this time?
Sure, absolutely. So I think it's also great to know that so much more has been opening around our institution. We're, as is everyone, we're still building back. We're actively hiring staff. So if you're looking for part-time roles or full-time roles, we are also one of those organizations that's hiring. So please consider us. It's a great place to work. I've been there 21 years, so I can tell you I love it. But we continue to build back. So with holiday nights in Greenfield Village for this year, we're bringing back fan favorites like ice skating, like our Model T rides, like carriage rides. So a lot of things have started back up. Indoors in the museum, we've reopened more of our hands-on and touchable experiences. We're still absolutely deep cleaning on a constant basis, but things like getting on board the Allegheny locomotive and seeing what it would be like to be the engineer in that space. Our children's related programs like our PNC sponsored Tinkering for Tots, which is for those youngest ages, that is also actively back in now. So great story times, wonderful artifact explorations. So stay tuned. A lot of things keep coming back up. We're listening to folks about what they most want us to restart. So we're trying our best to make sure that all happens for you.
Well, Cynthia, we appreciate your time and appreciate you joining us, telling us about some of these things that are coming up at the Henry Ford. Really interesting stuff over the next few months as we ring in the end of 2021 and begin 2022. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us.